Hello and welcome to Shep's Chat 502, a continuation of our Chapter 5 Civil Rights chapter. When we left off, we were talking about Brown versus the Board of Education and how we integrated the school system, making sure that all students, regardless of their ethnicity, could attend the same school. And then we had Brown versus the Board of Education too, which said you must do this with all deliberate speed. One way that we try to do this is through busing students. So there's two different types of segregation, typically de facto segregation, and that's just kind of, well, the way it is. So in the North, we had a lot of de facto segregation. Black people live in the inner cities, white people live in the suburbs. In the South, it was because African Americans and white people were legally separated from each other. Busing is a way to try to solve this primarily really in the North. So they're going to bus white kids to the black kids' school, and they're going to bus black kids to the white kids' school as a way to mix them. They also try to do this a little bit in the South. What ends up happening is nobody likes this. The white families aren't really ecstatic about having the black students in their classrooms. The black students really aren't all that ecstatic about, like 5 or 6 token white kids in their classrooms. And the fact that they have to ride the bus for so many hours a day trying to get to and from the schools doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So we start with a busing program, and that lasts for a couple of decades, slowly petering out towards the end. But even today, the segregation of schools is strongest in the North. The most segregated public schools in the nation are in the city of Milwaukee. All right, so the civil rights movement itself. King's first approach is the nonviolent approach, and he comes in and says, there's a better way to do this. We have to stop being violent, we have to stop letting them walk on us, but we need to protest. We need to have marches, we need to have sit-ins, we need to have speeches, we need to have demonstrations. We can boycott, we can do all of these things, but we need to come together and do it together. Black Power says, why do we really need to hang out with the white people? What makes it so that their way is so much better than our ways? And they're not exactly sure they're in favor of integration, and they are certainly not in favor of cultural assimilation. Why should Black people start acting like white people? It makes no sense to them. And that's where you're going to see leaders like Stokely Carmichael or Malcolm X come in. And it comes into a controversy between the Uncle Toms, as they were called, and the New Negroes. So Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be an Uncle Tom. Malcolm X would be one of those new Negroes. All right, so we have some new civil rights acts. So we have the Civil Rights Acts passed shortly after the end of the Civil War. In the 1960s, we're going to have like this second round of civil rights where we're not slaves anymore, but we'd like to be treated like we're equal human beings. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed arbitrary discrimination in voter registration. So in most states, you have to register before you vote, and this outlawed making it so that African Americans can vote. So like those grandfather clauses, things like that. It barred discrimination in public accommodations whose operations affect interstate commerce. So why does it only bar discrimination in public accommodations whose operations affect interstate commerce? Think about it. Why would that be? Oh yes, because of that little thing called federalism, so that they're only allowed to have control over interstate commerce. So they can't make laws affecting states that don't affect interstate commerce. So if you think about hotels, gas stations, bus stops, anything located on interstates, legitimately interstates in this case, are going to be public accommodations. The federal government can sue to desegregate public schools. It expands the rights of the Civil Rights Commission. They can withhold money from programs that they view as discriminatory. And then it establishes employment equality. So it says if there's an African American person that applies for the job, you have to give them the same rights and ability to do the job as a white person. There's a Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibits discriminatory practice for registration of voters again. And then there's certain parts of the country that cannot change their voting laws because voting is a state issue historically. So voters' laws cannot be changed in certain areas. So think Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, without the federal government's approval first. And this is a policy that is still in place today. So in states that have these policies, they are going to be less likely to have voter ID laws and things like that because it has to be approved by the federal government first. Wisconsin, on the other hand, would not be in that category. All right, so we get the civil rights issue, and then all of a sudden it seems like some people in the African American community have just lost their darn mind. So they start to riot in urban city centers, and the problem with this is, yes, I understand where Black people are frustrated, and yes, I totally understand why the African American community wants change now, and that they don't want to do it sitting down anymore. However, what it does is it takes away the sympathy that they had been getting from a lot of white people. And it pushes a lot of white people towards conservative viewpoints and gives them a different perspective of African Americans. And it changes the outlook of the civil rights movement. So it goes from this peaceful protest to why are these idiots burning down their own parts of the city? Segregation today. I understand that not everybody agrees that segregation exists, that there's white privilege or whatever it is, but there is some evidence of segregation still today. So 2 out of 5 minorities attend a school with a minority population of 90% or higher. So it would be if you are Latino and there are 5 of you, 2 of you in the room, go to a school that has pretty close to 100% minority population. There's going to be very few white students there. There's more unemployment among minorities, whatever the reasons for that may be. And census information is used to determine aid. So there's still some aid that is given out based on ethnic need, and that is used by the census, which goes around every 10 years and determines where people live and information about them, like their ethnicity, their gender, their socioeconomic status. All right, so also it goes along the lines of, you guys talk about this all the time. It's not about ethnicity, it's about the fact that they're poor. So should this be a poor people's campaign? Martin Luther King Jr. said that it's a cross-nationality issue. So the issues that African Americans were dealing with were the issues, the same exact issues that poor white people really were dealing with. Don't forget, it wasn't just white men. Not all white men were equal in the beginning. It is white property owning men that were considered equal. So poor people have always been historically discriminated against as well. Voter fraud, that's an issue that we've talked about in the past. And when we discuss it, it's not just an issue about minorities. There are plenty of poor white people that cannot afford to go to the DMV. They cannot afford to get their birth certificate. There needs to be alternative options if you're going to try to prevent voter fraud that does not discriminate against people who do not have the economic stability to go and get their birth certificate, their driver's license, etc. Right, so today's equality, well, who thinks that we have equality? Shocker, whites are 5 times more likely to believe that racial equality exists. So African Americans tend not to believe that racial equality has gotten to that point where we are all equal, but whites typically do. And a lot of times you'll hear the argument of, we had an African American president, how can you say that there's not equality? The fact that there's an African American president does not necessarily mean that there is total equality, but it's something that should be taken into account. That yes, an African American man or Caucasian man really has been able to reach the highest level of office, and that is something that Martin Luther King Jr. would have been ecstatic about. So there is definitely some pride. We have definitely made some major advancements since the era of the 1960s. All right. So far we've talked about African Americans. Clearly, they are not the only minorities that are out there. Asians and Hispanics have also been historically discriminated against. In Hernandez versus Texas, this is a case dealing with somebody that was accused of a crime, and the Hispanic person that was on trial says, "How can you say that I had a fair trial? I didn't have a single person on the jury that looked like me." So the 14th Amendment says juries must be composed without regard for race. So you cannot have a jury that is predominantly all white unless you want to have a mistrial or you want to have somebody appeal it. The Chicano movement is led by Cesar Chavez, and this is like the United Farm Workers, and they're going to boycott, specifically in this case, grapes, as a way to raise awareness of the migrant farm workers' plight. So they were underpaid, they were mistreated, and Cesar Chavez stands up and uses very similar tactics to those by Martin Luther King Jr. All right. Today there are lots of immigrants. 12% of the population in 2011 was born in another country. Latinos are the country's largest minority. 16% of the nation is Latino, 15% is African American, 5% is Asian, and 66% is white non-Latino. So whites are not the minority yet, but they are certainly getting there. That's a lot of people. There are 12 million undocumented people living in the U.S. right now. You might refer to these as illegals, but we talked about that's not really a PC term as well. People are not illegal. They might be committing an illegal act, but it does not make the person themselves illegal. Some of the issues that people have with the fact that there are 12 million undocumented people living in the United States is that there is an overcrowding of schools. It is a burden on the healthcare system, and that falls to the people that are legal citizens to pay for that, and that creates an issue. One way that you can become a legal citizen, if you are already here undocumented, is to join the military. That is something that some people feel is a good option. Other people feel is not a good option, that you should not be rewarded at all. So if you are here illegally, you are here illegally, and you should go home. All right, affirmative action. This is a policy in education or job hiring that gives special treatment to traditionally disadvantaged groups, so minorities, women, in an effort to overcome present effects of past discrimination. So we're not saying that people are discriminated against today. We're saying that the effects of past discrimination are still lingering and need to be corrected. It was started in 1965 by LBJ, and government agencies had to implement policies on how they would receive funding so they could make sure that they were reaching out to African Americans and other minority groups. In California v. Bakke, they say that affirmative action is legal. However, race cannot be the sole factor in the decision. So if all other things are equal, then you can take the African American person so that you can have greater diversity on your campus. But all other things have to be equal. In Fisher v. the University of Texas, which was just a couple of years ago, they ruled that, yeah, affirmative action is still legal. Once again, though, it cannot be the sole factor in the decision. And it should also be scrutinized by government agencies. All right, economic reparations. So a reparation is a compensation for doing something wrong to someone. So for some crazy reason, we paid the Japanese because, during World War II, we rounded them up and took away their property and put them in internment camps. But we've never paid the Native Americans for, coming over and moving them all around the country as we saw fit. And we never paid the African Americans for, taking them from their homelands and putting them in slavery. Clearly, the Japanese, those are people that we could pay right away. So we kind of realized our mistake enough that you were paying the actual people that had been affected. In the case of Native Americans and African Americans, one of the reasons why it's probably different is because it was not the actual groups that it happened to, it would have been their ancestors. All right, and that's where we are going to stop Chef's Chat 502. Thanks, guys. Pay attention because Chef's Chat 503 won't be far behind.